Very excited today to host James Galbraith. He spoke at one of our conferences 15 years ago in Sonoma. But today we are celebrating a really outstanding book that has just been published this year called Entropy Economics. And this is what we're going to be talking a lot about. We will be talking about other things too, but it seems like it's a primer for people who are interested in the Green New Deal, possibly even the degrowth movement. So James Galbraith, who we have known for quite some time, holds the Lloyd Benston Jr. Chair in Government Business Relations and a professorship in government at the University of Texas at Austin. He was executive director of the Joint Economic Committee of the U.S. Congress in the early 80s, and prior to that was an economist for the House Banking Committee. He chaired the Board of Economists for Peace and Security and directs the University of Texas Inequality Project. He also served as chief technical advisor for macroeconomic reform to the State Planning Committee of the People's Republic of China from 1993 to 1997. He holds degrees from Harvard University in economics and also an MA and a PhD from Yale University. And he's the author of many books, including Entropy Economics, which is the latest, but also Welcome to the Poison Chalice, The Destruction of Greece and the Future of Europe, The Predator State, which I just recently reread, and many others. So welcome, James. It's just wonderful to have you with us today and so appreciate your time.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
I'm going to let one more person in. Okay, the first question, I think, since most of us are not economists, I think it would make sense.
Don't rub it in, please. Don't rub it in.
Don't rub it in.
No.
Well, because we're not, I think it would be helpful for you to explain what entropy economics is. The words entropy and scarcity you use somewhat interchangeably, and these are not concepts associated with the American myth of having it all, or is it compatible with unlimited growth? So it's a big leap on almost every level from what you call equilibrium economics to entropy economics, even though, as you demonstrate, the latter is much more realistic and common sense policy. So tell us what entropy economics entails and how it would change our economic and political atmosphere.
Okay, well, this small book is an exercise co-authored with a mathematician who has a rather deep knowledge of the underlying physics as well, and my friend Jing Chen, University of Northern British Columbia. And in order to give you an idea of what we mean by entropy economics, it might be useful just to place it in the context of the standard textbook economics that most people would have been exposed to in an undergraduate class or even in a high school class in the conventional meaning of the field. That is a subject whose ideas go back to the dawn of classical Chinese philosophy that was taken into Europe in the 18th century. And the idea is an idea of a natural balance, a natural harmony that is expressed, became the conventional way to express that in the late 19th century, was into the 20th century, and today still, is the balance of supply and demand. That is to say that the economy is a kind of self-organizing entity whose primary players are buyers and sellers, and then the primary thing that they do is decide how much to produce and what price. And once they've decided that, you're in a state that can be continued. And this is an idea that became out of date in the development of science sometime in the middle of at least by the middle of the 19th century. And by the late 19th century, practically every discipline that deals with the real world, biology, physics, anthropology, sociology, had moved on. And economics had made an effort to move on in various ways, including Marxism and later Keynesianism. But these were largely, they were repressed. They received a lot of pushback, and they did not become dominant ways of looking at the field. And so what we're trying to do is to say, economies are not different in the fundamental way they operate from any other life process. They are not different from the way biological entities, you and I, and any animal or any plant, operates. They're not different from the way mechanical processes operate. They simply do the same things on a larger scale. And what are those things? They draw on resources. They take advantage of those resources if they can to produce something with a little bit of margin so that you get some use and some value out of it. And they do this according to plans, which are in you and me, they're sort of laid down in our genes, or they're laid down in blueprints or mechanical drawings. In societies, they're laid down in regulations, laws, habits, customs, constitutions. So that everything that we do, including the creation of markets, is done in the context of social rules and regulations, and is done necessarily by making fixed investments, drawing on resources. And that creates a set of sort of inexorable, let's say, complications or realities that have to be dealt with. One is that the more complex and the more efficient your society is, the more fragile. That is simple organisms and simple societies can persist for very long periods of time. Rather complicated ones really depend upon their conditions, upon favorable conditions continuing to prevail. And that may not be the case. And that gets to what you were saying earlier about resource limitations. If resources that you were previously relying on become expensive or unusable for some other reason, then the society either has to adapt or it's going to run into existential problems. Then there's, I could go on in that vein. The other thing I'd just say is that if you don't have a regulatory structure, if you don't have a governing structure, you won't have an efficient functioning of a market or any other kind of economy in the first place. And so there's a tradition in conventional economics to say there's market on one side, the government on the other, and the government interferes with the market. And what we're saying is, no, sorry. In the actual real world, it is a regulatory mechanism, a governing organization that sets the context within which markets develop, the markets and production processes develop. So that will give you a good sort of an opening screed, if you like, for how this presentation sets us apart from what you'd find in a conventional textbook economics. And the advantage of working with my colleague and friend is that we were able to set this up not only in what I hope is reasonably clear English, but also in a format which may not be everybody's cup of tea, but which is mathematically precise.
Yeah, so now would you give us some details about the entropy theory so that we have a good sense of what that's about?
Well, entropy is the tendency of all activity to tend toward greater disorder. It's the tendency of heat always to move from the hotter to the colder object. It is an idea that was not fully appreciated in physical science until, I don't know, the second half of the 19th century, but has come to be known, the second law of thermodynamics, as the most fundamental law of nature. You simply can't have a description of the world or any of the universe or the cosmos that doesn't comply with the second law. And that's what's so peculiar about mainstream economics, is that it doesn't. What does this? How to express the way this works in the presentation we make? We say every process, life process, social process, taps into a flow of entropy. It taps into high quality, low entropy resources and tries to do something with them before they deteriorate into high entropy and essentially hard to use or impossible to use materials. So that's why why when oil was discovered in Texas in 1930, the United States as a country had a tremendous opportunity to restructure its economy around a very high quality resource, and did so. That's why we had, the development of an automobile, aviation-based society that emerged in the 20th century. Then you have to ask, well, if that's if it's true that that is no longer a viable way forward, then what are the realistic alternatives?
And so entropy economics is really basing it on natural systems, on biological systems, on the second law of thermodynamics and physical systems, whereas the supply and demand economics and that the original utility theory that was formalized, as you mentioned in the book, by Kenneth Arrow and Gerard Debreu, for which they won a Nobel Prize. It makes one suspicious about Nobel Prizes, I guess. These theories led economics or economists to judge research based on mathematical rigor instead of on economical relevance in the real world. And I think this is a crucial point because this belief in abstraction over reality persists in many disciplines, but especially in economics.
Oh, I know. Actually, this is not the way we look at it. I'll just, if I don't mind stopping you there.
Sure, go ahead.
The mathematics in the formal presentation of general equilibrium theory, and in almost all, and the vast majority of articles that you will pick up and read in, if you want to try, in the dominant journals, is largely unreadable. It is not, I would call, an exercise in rigor. It's mostly an exercise in intimidation. We're not against mathematics. And there are 2 chapters of our book, which are frankly mathematical. And they express a theory of value, and they express the problem of the production decision in mathematical form. Not against that. The point is that you can also express those ideas, and the rest of the book does so, or attempts to do so, in clear English. The 2 are compatible. The mathematics gives you a way of quantifying things, of putting some actual measures, and saying, well, what are the consequences of let's say, working it through. But it's clear, it's straightforward, and it's not that difficult for, it's essentially, most of it's accessible to at high school level mathematics, and the production equation may be a little bit more complicated than that. But it's not the elaborate mathematics, algebra, algebraic language that's intended to isolate you from thinking from the larger public, which is what is essentially I would argue, the purpose of the economics journal and the mathematization of it. With all respect, we're my co-author is a mathematician. It has physics is a discipline with mathematical precision, and our object is to try and bring some of that to economics. Now, to come back to the mainstream conception, credit it to Arrow and Debreu, but they're really just tying up a set of ideas that go back much, much further in history. They really go back. And it's, I think, important to recognize that, as I said earlier, they were brought over to the French court in the 18th century from China, from Chinese philosophy. And it was very compatible to the ideas of the 18th century, the French monarchy, that the world would go on forever in a state of balance. An idea that came to a rather abrupt and shocking end in 1789. And from that point forward, the world was clearly changing in very rapid and fundamental ways. And the energy basis of the economy was changing. Coal was coming in, and steam power was coming in. Modern industry was being created. And a whole set of principles emerged from that. An understanding of the way the world works emerged from that, which by the late 19th century had given you evolutionary biology and the laws of thermodynamics and physics. But the economists just resisted this. They simply didn't want to have it. That led toward Marxism. It led in a tamer version of the 20th century to Keynesianism. And the political implications of those ideas were so unpleasant and shocking that they were just repudiated. And so you get Arrow and Debreu and their followers saying, general equilibrium was the way in which we need to think about the world. And a whole cult of people brought up to do that. But it's not very useful. It gets them into every kind of trouble, including, as you remember from 16 years ago, the complete inability to anticipate a financial crisis. Well, can't happen. Why? Because the system's in balance. And if it's most likely thing is it will go on as it has been going on. So that if something happens that's difficult, that's a shock. That came from outside the system and nobody could have foreseen it. And anybody who did foresee it was a nobody. That's kind of sort of involuted self-protective thinking. And we're saying,
Yes.
not time to really replace the whole framework with something that's consistent with the way in which largely every other, every other perspective on the real world.
Right. That was part of what I was getting to, was the abstraction, not putting down the mathematics, but the abstraction that it allowed. And where that type of, or the equilibrium economics became more like a religion, that you have to adhere to it, at least in our society. And I wondered if this just is a short question, so I want to go on to something else, but if you see any movement among mainstream economists or even outside the mainstream who are understanding the ideas and supporting entropy economics and not just going with the old style.
Well, the book has only been out for 5 months now,
Right.
6 months. And a couple of reviews have appeared, which were thrilling, actually. One of them from the Central European University, the Faculty of Law, one of them from the International Monetary Fund. And so, somewhat to my surprise, and certainly to my pleasure, at least the first serious readers of the book have taken a largely favorable view. Now, whether there will be any reaction from the let's say the entrenched profession, I don't care to anticipate. We have had some very interesting and helpful and supportive correspondence from people who are approaching this subject with a background in physics or biology, for whom these ideas are largely, they're familiar. There's nothing. We're not claiming that we've invented something here. We are simply taking a set of perspectives that have been long mainstream in the real sciences and also in a lot of human sciences, and applying them to the problems of economic organization.
Now, I know there are many people who will be interested in what your perspective is in relationship to China, since you've lived there and worked with the government. What is your sense of what's happening with the tariffs? Where do you think this is going? What's it doing to our relationship with China? And what will it do economically to our country?
I didn't actually live in China. For 4 years, I held the title Chief Technical Advisor to the State Planning Commission for Macroeconomic Reform under a UNDP project that they had with the Chinese government at that time. Mostly I was operating from my base in Texas and going once or twice a year to meet with my Chinese counterparts and work out what were essentially training programs. It was a very interesting moment, 1993 to 1997, just as the urban and industrial development that has since come to be the face of China to the outside world was really gathering steam. And we've seen now, it's been 30 years since that time, and 30 years is a long enough time for a huge transformation to have occurred. China was at that time still largely rural, largely agrarian economy. It is now largely urban economy, and at the time, its industrial activity was transitioning really from the Soviet period of the 50s and 60s to the rapidly growing, what was then light industry, export industry, that was beginning to emerge in the world market. And now it's an economy with very strong technology, engineering, infrastructure, which it is deploying not only at home, but also around the world. And you can see a lot of developing countries taking advantage of the Chinese capacity to put down ports, airports, railroads, bridges, the basic underpinnings of a stronger and more organized economic process. The tariffs, well, we already had one round with the tariffs, and it became quickly clear that the integration between the US and the Chinese economies over the past 30 years was such that if you really disrupted the flow of goods and supplies into the American market, it would be American companies and American consumers who would take the hit. And after that was clear, Treasury Secretary Besant went to Geneva and said to the Chinese, well, we've reconsidered our position. The Chinese said, fine. And the Chinese position was, you can do what you want, really. It's not going to bother us one way or another very much, because our economy is, first of all, oriented toward China, and secondly, to the rest of the world, and we're no longer dependent on access to the American market. It's nice. There's some businesses that benefit from that, but it's as a share of the whole Chinese economy, it's not what it was 25 years ago. So the Chinese basically said, fine, you pull back, we'll pull back. And then, of course, they've come now with whatever the tariff number for August 1st or August 30th, whatever it is, and we'll see what happens. But my instinct here is that the thing to predict is a lack of predictability and an adjustment when it becomes clear, if it becomes clear that the costs are really substantial.
I think people here, at least in the US, are not aware of how advanced China is in many areas, which would be good for us to learn more about. But I think primarily we've been kind of denied that information. It's just not in our media that much. But I also want you to go now to Greece, because I know you were an advisor to Yanis Varoufakis when he was the Greek finance minister. And in the attempt to resist the cruel bailout that was being foisted on them by the troika of the IMF, the European Central Bank, and the EU Commission. And even though there was a referendum in Greece where 61% of the voters rejected the conditions of the proposed bailout, the Prime Minister, Alexis Tsipras, overruled the people and accepted these ruinous conditions of the bailout. And I would like to get your opinion of it. I know Varoufakis has spoken out against that capitulation quite frequently. And I just would like to get some ideas from you on how you see the European troika really controlling so much of the economy in the Euro region.
Yeah, well, I was and am a close friend of Yanis Varoufakis. He was my colleague for several years at the University of Texas, just before the election that brought Syriza to power in early 2015. And when he became finance minister, a day or two later, he asked me to get myself to Athens, which I did. And I was in and out for this period of the 5 months of the Varoufakis ministry. And leading up to through the very difficult and essentially fruitless negotiations with the with the troika, the finance ministers, European finance ministers, and through the referendum. By about the middle of that period, it was clear to us, to Yanis and to myself, that the Tsipras government was undermining his position, undermining its own ostensible bargaining position, and preparing to give the Europeans what they wanted, give the IMF what it wanted. The referendum was called on the expectation that the Greek public would be scared into accepting the terms. And so it was a surprise, in spite of the appearances to the government, when the Greek public said, no, we don't accept it. And we support, among other things, they strongly supported the positions that Yanis Varoufakis was articulating. And I was there for that night of the referendum in Athens. And 11 o'clock or so, Giannis went to see the prime minister. It became clear that they were going to capitulate anyway. Giannis resigned the next morning.
Mm.
So what's happened since then has been a steady transformation of the Greek economy into uh, a highly privatized, uh, strongly tourist oriented, much more strongly tourist oriented even than it was before, economy with very depreciated and decaying public services. As anybody who goes to Athens, I was just there last month. It's clear, and even I think the suburban train that runs from the airport to Piraeus is run by an Italian company now, and you're just seeing uh, a process of dispossession of the Greeks of their own country, and that is very much to the advantage of the foreign companies who wanted to take the place over, and effectively that's what's going on.
Yeah, it's really sad to see that happen.
Yes.
I want to briefly mention or ask you about cryptocurrencies. I don't want to get into a whole thing on it, but it seems to be a big deal right now. And Bitcoin keeps going up and up in its value. However, it seems like a gambling casino to me, and I wanted to get your input on it. Do you see this a crash inevitable in the cryptocurrency markets?
Um, well, there's certainly a risk of crisis, especially as with the new law, I think that's now coming into effect. You'll get a lot of private companies issuing so-called stable coins. Uh, they what can I mean, Bitcoin where we're now is very volatile. So but with the stable coins, there is a presumption that this is a means of payment against which the issuer will hold a 100% dollar reserve of approved currencies, but presumably in most cases dollars. And then the question is, how do you monitor that? The temptation, the amazing temptation in this is simply to trim your reserves and issue more stable coins. So you're basically printing your own money. That's very nice, except if someone decides that maybe you're not reliable and decides to cash those stable coins in and the dollar reserves aren't there. And then you have this basically the classic problem of the run on the bank, which has not been much of an issue in the United States since the early 1930s. Why? Because we have federal deposit insurance. And so people who have deposits in banks don't think they need really they're not constantly worrying about whether the bank will close, because up to the limit, they'll get their money back one way or another. And that will not be the case with stablecoins. So I can certainly see circumstances that would generate a classic financial crisis. There's nothing new under the sun here, except that when we even had a period of private banking and free banking in the United States in the 19th century, it was very unstable and complex, and made ordinary transactions much more, let's just say, exciting than they needed to be. And that could easily become a prevailing situation if this tendency moves along.
And the last question I want to ask, because I want to open it up for people to ask questions who are on the call. But one of the things we've noticed that time after time, era after era, humans have a history of depleting resources. And such as the increases that you mentioned in the book of iron production that led to deforestation. And in the 1930s, new farm equipment broke up soil and helped create the Dust Bowl that's using up resources pretty much era after era, and we don't seem to learn from history. So now with the kind of unregulated consumption of fossil fuel, which could destroy the planet, we're on course for that. how would entropy economic theory help handle this? And do you see, where do you see a plan developing where we could get out of this train that we're on of constantly using up resources? Do you see any possibility that we can get off of this projection and how we might do that?
I have to be depressingly candid to say that the book does not contain pat solutions or even complicated and highly articulated solutions. The first thing you have to do is understand how the processes work. And there is a tendency in the campaign to constantly find solutions to problems, to assume away physical difficulties that really should not be assumed away. The great advantage that fossil fuels, nuclear power, have is that they return vastly more energy than it takes to extract, than it takes to get them. At least that historically has been the case. And so they're very high quality in terms of the amount of work you can get out of them. And oil's higher quality than coal. Natural gas, which is half hydrogen, is very high quality, though it's harder to manage. The idea that one can replace this with a decentralized collection of sunlight, essentially, either wind or solar, is something that has to be approached, in my view, with a lot of caution, because one really has to ask, what are the conditions to make that required? Is it possible to make that work? And so far as I can see, the answer is probably not. And so you're really playing with the viability of the economic system. And that's the trade-off, essentially. The viability of the economic system, the viability of the environmental system. These two things may be in conflict. Sorry to say.
Yeah, that's disturbing. The cost of extractions was something you brought up in the book, and we don't see that a lot. We see the technical fixes as being just that, technical fixes, and they don't have externalities. And
Not sure. I mean, if you want to make your power system dependent upon sunlight, you have to have a storage mechanism. That means you have to have large-scale battery storages, which is based current state of technology on lithium, which means you have to extract that. You have to make the technologies work, which so far hasn't been demonstrated at the kind of scales that we're talking about. And you have to ask, how much land would you have to cover with solar panels or windmills? And what are the consequences of doing that? So can you get the wires necessary to move the power from where it's generated to where it would be distributed? That's a very large amount of transmission. All of these things are problems which need to be faced squarely and honestly, rather than simply saying, well, we'll just give a tax subsidy and expect the market will fix this problem. The market won't fix this problem.
Yeah, I want to just put in one final thing, and then I do have someone with a hand up for question, but that's about private debt. And you talked about that in, I think, both of your books that I've read recently, the public debt becoming private debt. And one of the things that's been happening, at least since COVID, and well, it started before, but accelerated under COVID, is the debt that American citizens are under at this point. Both student loan debt, which is now at, I think, $1.78 trillion of student loan debt is outstanding. Credit card debt is 46% of Americans are in credit card debt, which leads to $1.2 trillion. So with this amount of debt that people are in, ordinary citizens are in, it seems like at some point it could explode because the other thing that's just happened this last year is credit card companies are saying they're now raising interest rates for some people to 35%. This seems like usury and should be illegal. So do you see that? Where do you see this going? It just seems to be accelerating where there's more and more debt on an individual level in our country.
Right. Well, the difference between the country and the individual is that the country, in the case of the United States and other large countries, issues debt that it can service with the currency it creates itself. You and I can't do that.
Right.
We have to earn income to cover our debts, and our incomes are constrained. And that is why private debts can lead to crises of repayment. And that happens periodically. There's no reason to expect that it won't happen again. And the debts have to be written down. And that is a painful process involving bankruptcies, foreclosures, homelessness, unemployment, lots of misery. And so then the question is, what kind of policy is required to restructure those debts to enable the system to have another lease on life? Or what do you do to create an alternative system that doesn't have the same level of dependence on unpayable, unsustainable debts? And those questions, again, faced periodically, and the usual answer is you bail everybody out and just let the whole thing start again, and then wait another 10 or 15 years, and the problem will come up again. And that I wouldn't be the least bit surprised to see what we're 16 years since the last great crisis, that there might be another one.
And not so optimistic, is it?
Optimism is not something which is a requirement
Right.
for someone in my line of work.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
I want to go to some questions now. I see Jerry Bernhardt has his hand up. And if you want to ask a question, I think most of you know how to use the automatic hand raiser function on your computer. So please do that if you want to ask something. Jerry, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. To follow up on George's question about resource extraction and depletion, could you speak a little more explicitly about the possibility of resolving the climate crisis while maintaining economic growth?
What possibility are you talking about here?
Well, I'm specifically.
I am skeptical.
Yeah, well, okay. I could be maybe a little more.
No, I understand. I mean, if we talk about the climate crisis, we're really talking largely about carbon dioxide being accumulating in the atmosphere. That's that's the main thing. The main sources of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are coal, oil. Natural gas is somewhat less because, as I said before, it's half hydrogen. Then you have other sources. Okay, what power sources do you have that emit considerably less when you take into account the concrete and so forth that needs to be produced to make them work? Hydropower largely exploited, nuclear power in a kind of impasse. Can you imagine moving all of the current electrical power generation that's based on coal, into something else? Well, natural gas again. Then you get some limits. Are you going to reverse the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere? The answer to that is there's very little evidence that will be done or can be done. We are now using more coal, more oil, more natural gas now than we ever were in the past, and adding new sources of power, including renewables, just has the effect, and this is something that's called Jevons Law. It was articulated over 150 years ago, has the effect of creating new uses for power, data centers, artificial intelligence, Bitcoin mining, rather than actually substituting against the uses that against the sources that we're already using. So the answer to your question would be, I think I'm quite pessimistic about the possibility of, or the likelihood of, overcoming the challenge of increasing the increasing carbon content of the atmosphere. Is it a solution to go to negative economic growth? I'm skeptical about that because, by and large, if you want people to engage in economic activity, run businesses, they have to expect a positive return. A positive return doesn't have to be a maximal return, doesn't have to be a high return, but a positive return on what they're doing is the motivation for engaging in any kind of economic activity beyond the most mere survival. And even that, you won't even plant a garden if the effort to plant it is not rewarded with an excess of vegetables to support your effort in bringing it to bear. So this is a historic problem, and one which I'm not sympathetic to the idea of just saying we can invent something called negative growth. Why would anybody work under those circumstances? You're constantly making losses. The answer is they don't.
That would not be the same as degrowth.
I mean, one can argue for a low rate of growth. One can argue for a low rate of return, a low rate of interest. You can argue against waste, and there's where I think I would put my emphasis. Where are the great sources of waste? The financial sector, the military, and one can argue, some aspects of the consumption budget. And you can argue about the mix of public and private amenities, including security, education, healthcare, how these things are structured. You can make the society run much more efficiently. That's not the same thing as saying you're making it run at a negative rate of growth.
Right. Since I don't see any questions right now, I want to ask something else then. You mentioned in the previous book, and actually in this one too, in the Predator State, about the necessity of having a plan for the future and about the inadequacy of the liberals' policy because it tends to lack vision. And getting into politics a little bit, the Democratic Party has been against Trump, against losing our democracy, against a plethora of policies, but they have not put forth a compelling vision that would inspire voters, especially new and young voters. And they have been unable to attach themselves from the corporate donors. So I wanted to know how you view the plans that are being put forth by candidates that are Democratic socialists, AOC, Bernie, and recently Mondani. How do you see this as being a vision that people will embrace in the country? Do you see that as a possible path for the Democratic Party as well?
I am not an enthusiast for the recent trajectory of the Democratic Party. Let's go back over 30 or 40 years and ask ourselves what actually happened. We saw that the blow taken by the industrial core of the country and by the trade unions from the late 1970s into the early 1990s, and then a rise of two major new sectors, or let's say more deeply empowered sectors. Basically on the two coasts. On the East Coast, the financial sector, banking, insurance, hedge funds, all of that. And on the West Coast, information technology, along with aerospace and various aspects, spin-offs of the military sectors. Right? And those two poles of the American economy became, in the Clinton era and beyond, the mainsprings of the Democratic Party. On the one hand, they became the source of its funding, and it's largely of its support base, which it's become basically bipolar in the sense that on one side you have urban professionals who are relatively well-to-do, and then a series of minority communities who are low income and vote for the Democrats out of historical loyalty. Republicans sit in the middle. Actually, they're the party of the states which are primarily small towns, rural, suburban, mostly white, and this is the basic structure. So have the Democrats, whose entire policy is determined by their relatively prosperous financial base and the relatively prosperous professionals who populate the party, come up with a vision to provide general prosperity for the whole country? And I think the answer to that is clearly that they haven't. They've gone along with continual shaving back of the great institutions that were created under Roosevelt, for the period from Roosevelt to Lyndon Johnson. And they have not challenged the completely, I think, dysfunctional and out-of-date foreign policy, which is continuous across administrations of both policy parties, and which continues to insist on some notion of national supremacy in a world which is not going to accept or tolerate any country's national supremacy, and preparations for military confrontations in the Middle East, in Europe, in what we now call the Indo-Pacific. This is a formula which has been pursued and was being pursued under democratic administrations, which is extremely dangerous for the country, and one which, as I said, so far as I know, there's no significant force within the Democratic Party that's taking a strong stand against it.
Hey, Raphael, I see you have your hand up. Do you want to add something?
Yes. Hello to everybody. I'm from Montreal, Canada. Mr. Galbraith.
Très bien, salut.
Bonjour, Monsieur Galbraith.
Bonjour, bonjour.
You already answered partially to my question, and my question is really, what are the real economic problems in the United States, the real ones? What?
Yeah, I mean, the serious issues, I think you should come down from Montreal and just have a look around. I think you'll see fairly clearly what the issues are. We have a backlog of social and physical decay that needs to be addressed, and therefore need to reallocate resources in a serious way toward the environmental system, toward toward housing, toward the living conditions in American cities and towns, toward the structures of pay, to give people, in a sense, has some better lives than less stressed lives than they're now experiencing. And that needs to happen on a basis which is, as I say, not simply from the perspective of the groups of the population that are doing relatively well. And that is, again, the problem of the Democratic Party, because that's who it represents.
We have quite an international.
The same thing with the Liberals in Canada, I think, essentially is very similar.
We have an international audience online today. I'm just going to skip a bit because I'd like to go to Fred. Fred is an American professor at Mondragon University in Spain. Fred, do you want to ask your question? Where did you go?
Sure. Thanks, Georgia. Thanks for organizing this. Greetings. I'm interested in your work with the Texas Inequality Project and what sorts of conclusions you might be able to summarize about how to best address it. Whether, I mean, coming from Mondragon and sharing an interest in Georgia about shared ownership, cooperative ownership, if that fits into the mix at all, in your view?
I'll say just a little bit about this project, which is largely a measurement project, largely a research project. And the problem that research into this field has is reliance on partial, sketchy, and in many cases, unreliable and inconsistent data sources. And what we were able to do in this project was to show that there are plenty of ways of improving on the measurement of inequality, not just in the United States, but around the world. And once you have considerably more, we have measures which have more signal and less noise, you can look for patterns in that data. And what we, I mean, I could point to any number of significant and interesting observations that have come out of that project over the years. But if I had to say what was the most central one, It was an understanding that there was a large movement of increasing inequality in most countries around the world that ran from 1980 to 2000. And why? Because this was the moment of the neoliberal revolution, the debt crises that affected the world, beginning in Latin America and then Central Europe, the Soviet Union, and finally in Asia. And essentially, this is the driving force. So that the inequalities, increasing inequality experienced by much of the world, not every place, but much of the world, was essentially part of a common pattern in the global financial economy. It was a global macroeconomic phenomenon. And that is a very distinct perspective. You won't find it in the conventional treatment, which has got its blinders on, thinking in terms of labor markets and so forth and national institutions. And we're saying, no, look, you look at the data, things are happening all around the world at the same time or in close ordered sequence, according to things, major events that everybody knows happened. And that then gives you a real perspective on what's driving inequality in the capitalist system worldwide. Now, within the United States, you have a different story. In the United States, it's largely the extreme increase in the capital wealth of the very rich who own the companies in the financial sector and the information sector. You can see that very, very clearly in the data. And I could go on in this vein for quite some time, but this is it's all up on our website, and I encourage people to explore it because it's a huge amount of work and lots and lots of different dimensions. Eventually, when I get one more book out, the next one will be to recapitulate all this work, and then we can have another session to discuss it. It was my bread and butter research project for a quarter of a century.
Can we get that website in the chat box, Jamie?
Yeah, sure, I can. Yeah, indeed.
And I'll go to I'll just wait for you to do that, and then I'll go to Jonathan has a question.
Thank you. I have the question I'm sure everybody's dying to know, so to speak. What do the fascist Republicans think how they think that our economy can bear their BBB disaster? I mean, what's the end result? That billionaires will be alive all alone, no old people, no help from people of color, no poor people, as Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security are gone, no people with disabilities. What do we have to look forward to on that? I think it's just, I can't figure out what's going to happen. That's why I'm asking you. All I can see is get ready to die.
Well, let me put it this way. And I've written a couple of things on this that have appeared in the last few days. I see the problem of this bill being the pressures placed by the budget process, which then gives, it complicates the question of defending the elderly, the very poor, the people in nursing homes, people who are served by rural hospitals. Those people say, well, yeah, Medicaid's nice, but we have this terrible national debt, which is a huge burden going on to our grandchildren. Nobody can explain exactly what that burden is or why it justifies putting financial pressure on rural hospitals and nursing homes. What it is about maybe getting rid of rural hospitals and nursing homes would do to improve the productivity of the economy. The answer to that is absolutely nothing. We're confusing ourselves. I had a great deal of sympathy, obviously, for Hakeem Jeffries's long speech against the passage of the bill, but he's still saying, well, but the other problem is that there's $4 trillion of excess national debt. Let's not kid ourselves. In 2017, the tax law was changed under the first Trump administration, and it was sunset after 8 years. So the end of 2025, if nothing was happened, tax rates would go back up. Everybody knew that wasn't going to happen. So why, when they simply largely extend the existing tax law under which we've lived for 7 years, and we haven't suffered too much from it, do they feel the need to justify that by cutting Medicaid? Doesn't make any sense to me. It's simply an artifact of a budget process which puts the focus on some abstract mumbo jumbo about interest rates and debt burdens and so forth, giving essentially a set of lobbies a lever to argue that essentially chipping away at what are the major protective institutions for the American public. And as Medicare is already going to be triggered by cuts in Medicare will be triggered by a further determination by the Congressional Budget Office that the deficit is above a certain target value. That's, I think, already in the bill. And Social Security will come after that, even though we say we won't touch Social Security. They won't touch Social Security until nothing else is left except the military budget. And so that's where we're heading. And I have to say, again, you can say what you want about the Republicans, but my focus is on trying to get the Democrats to show some clarity and some spine, to understand that the budget process is a scam that they've been going along with for far too long. Mm-hmm. And then if you really want to cut something serious, well, then you need to cut back the defense budget and you need to find a way to cut back the financial sector. Those are the two big sources of real waste in the American economy, do no perceptible good to anybody, except for, in the case of finance, a small number of people who actually own the system. And that's where we should be focusing our efforts. When we do that, we'll have a political party worth being part of. Until we do, I don't think we will.
I'm going to take one last question, and this should be short because we are at the hour. So Mary, go ahead. Mary, wherever you are. Well, we're not finding her. I think she's gone. Yeah. I think, you know, one area that's been really hard for a lot of us at Praxis has been the constant growth of the military budget. It just goes on, and we have more and more wars we're engaged in, and it just doesn't seem to end, no matter which party's in power. The same wars are still supported by both parties.
We are committed and tied in to a military paradigm that emerged out of the Second World War, based on overseas bases, aircraft carriers, nuclear weapons. Very expensive and militarily tremendously ineffective. They don't actually project American power. The technologies have changed. That was an era of propeller planes, if you like, and surface ships and so forth. And that's not the world we live in now. We now live in a world of long distance, high precision, hypersonic missiles. And we can't project power. Bases are just targets. Ships are just targets, essentially. We couldn't, whatever you think of the merits of the conflict in the Middle East, the Ansar Allah, the Houthis in Yemen, driven Western ships out of the Red Sea. Right? Do you really think that it would be any easier to take on a major military power? This is the recent war in the Middle East, and the Iranians showed what missiles can do. So we need to, take this on board. And I think that essentially the only way forward is a comprehensive security architecture, peace treaties that recognize the interests of the other major powers. Not everybody's interest is going to be served by those, but in the nature of the world, there are major powers, and major powers' interests have to be served. We are one of them, but we are no longer, if we ever were, the unique hegemonic power. And we have a whole generation of political leaders who came along in the 1990s and said, America's going to run the world. America is not going to run the world going forward, and it has to find a way to live peacefully and at a much smaller burden on our economy if we're going to prosper along with the other countries. along with China, along with the Russian Federation, amongst, in particular, along with the emerging powers in the Middle East, just for example.
Yeah, we have to stop demonizing and start negotiating and cooperating. This is something we
But we have to, yes, we have to negotiate, but we also have to do so in good faith and with a serious intent to respect the agreements that we reach. And then we'll have to see if the other side prove to be as unreliable as some of their detractors say, that will be a problem. But it's also possible, and I would argue their history indicates that they're really quite reliable. And in the event, trusting on the reliability of your adversaries is the only real path toward a more peaceful world.
All right. Well, on that note, I think we will close. And I just want to mention again the book, Entropy Economics, The Living Basis of Value and Production, which I think everyone on this call would really appreciate. I know we have it at our local bookstore in Sonoma, Reader's Books, so I am going to recommend that too. And thank you so much, Jamie, for being with us today and taking time
Thank you very
to
much.
answer our question. Really
Enjoyed the conversation, and I really appreciate you all being here. Very nice to see you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.